Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening if you're joining us from Europe or the Middle East. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Got over 100 folks listening, close to 300 registered. So I'm not sure how many more are going to tune in as we go along. But today's session is recordable injuries versus serious injuries. And we're going to be asking the panelists, we're all aware that the total number of recordables has come down significantly over the last 10 years, but the serious injuries and fatalities have been persistently sort of stuck. Now, Alex, I'm not sure. I'll introduce everybody in a second, but Alex, I know they've made a bit of headway with the fatalities in the UK, and I know you've got some operations there, so I could maybe get you to comment a bit about on that later. But we have with us just some excellent panelists to comment on all this. Some of them, if you've tuned in before, you've heard, but David Bianco from Epiroc is with us. Epiroc, David, I'll let you do the 30-second elevator speech on Epiroc, but basically anywhere there's mining in the world, you'll either have Epiroc operations making equipment or service technicians. We have John McGilvery from Scott Forge with us. I'm not sure exactly how many locations you have now, John. I know I've been at the one with you, and I don't think I'll ever forget when you looked at me and you said, Larry, I cannot confirm nor deny that might be a Tomahawk missile head right there. I mean, it just looked like a big circle to me, but you could also give us a bit about that, Scott Forge. And then Alex Carnival is the Chief Performance Officer for ETEX. Alex lives in Luxembourg now, but he's worked at positions in management, senior management, not just with ETEX, but with a lot of other Fortune 500 companies. And Alex has also been with me on the expert panels in Europe, as well as some in the Middle East and India. So again, Alex, thanks very much for joining us. And then Peter Betroni was the Health Safety Environmental Director for American Electric. Thankfully, Peter is working with us now as a SafeStart consultant, but mostly I'm going to get him to talk from his perspective as an HSE director, although certainly, Peter, you can comment from what you've heard from the clients you've worked with. And if you've joined us before, you'll no doubt remember Teg Matthews. Now, Teg is Vice President of Business Development with SafeStart, but Teg is also working with focus groups, 50 to 60 different companies, maybe not all as big as Epiroc or ETEX or Procter & Gamble or Crown Cork and Seal or some of the companies, ABB, that we've had on the show, but definitely some very significant players. So Teg's job is to sort of provide us with, as best he can, the collective perspective from those companies. But obviously, you feel free to some specific highlights here and there too, Teg, if you'd like. But just to set the stage, everybody, and in case you all didn't memorize the piece that came out in the email, recordable injuries versus serious injuries. Why have only recordable injuries come down? It's common knowledge by now that serious injuries and fatalities have not come down over the last 10 years, the same way total recordable injuries have. There have been many theories put forward, but so far, for most companies, it's been a struggle. Is it because the theory or model of serious injury causation is flawed? Or is it because we just haven't been working the system properly? In other words, it's not the theory or it's the lack of execution or effective execution that's causing this persistent problem. So in other words, Are we not going at the problem and that's why it's not getting fixed? Or are we going at the problem properly, but we're just not doing that solution effectively? And eventually, as it says here, somebody has to decide. What are we going to do? We're going to stay the course, or are we going to try a new approach? So the whole idea of these expert panels is to try to provide the practical versus the theoretical. In other words, you can go to conferences and you can listen to academics give you a theoretical perspective. All they've got to do is get on the plane and fly back to the university, whereas you guys had to fly back and actually live with the consequences of what you were going to decide. So let me just start with David Bianco. David, why don't you, if you could, just tell us what's happened over the last several years. I know there's been a merger and acquisition, but a fair bit of consistency in operations and personnel through that. So, if you could maybe talk about the last 7 to 10 years, the trends and/or plateaus you've noticed, and just so much that I'll go to everybody and I'll just get them to talk about the trends and plateaus. And then if I could, we'll come back and get everybody to talk then about, what did they do about it and a bit of that decision process and the path forward from there.
Great. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
Since about 2012, when I took over, we locations that I was involved with, we had near double-digit total recordable rates, and if not more, and then near double-digit even lost time rates. So we had definitely some issues related to this. And when we started our journey to change behavior here, which was in 2013, one of the things we noted was, the big numbers started to come down fairly quickly, and we got to where we would have maybe eight recordables a year instead of 35. So wow. we got that big advantage. But just like U.S. football, getting down the field's not too hard, but that last 10 yards can suck. So that's basically sometimes what we found. So even year after year, we would have a year where we'd have 8. And maybe the next year we'd have 7. And it's that, we said, boy, we feel like we're better than that. And so what we did is we went back and started to look at how much these cases, how much cost the case had that went through our workers' comp carrier. And we found the one year we went from $350,000 for 8 recordables and about $40,000 for 7 the next year. So the average cost per case came down dramatically. And we kind of knew that because if a guy gets 1 stitch, that's a recordable. If a guy breaks his arm, it's a recordable, right? But the cost of what that is and the impact to the business, even if you don't have lost time days, you may have restricted work days. You kind of know in your gut that one is more serious than the other. And so right. we have been using that as our gauge to do a insurance cost per case or medical cost per case on these to give us a better gauge of how we're performing. And that's been very effective. And frankly, it's one of the things that really was visible when upper management saw this and said, hey, if SafeStart was contributing to this kind of a change, in impact, not only to the business, but to the people, then that's what we want to do globally.
Okay, so I let you get a little ahead of where I wanted, but it's okay. So from a very high number to sort of a 7 or 8 plateau, you were like not something that you were happy with, but a steep downward to a plateau, because that was certainly the most common trend out there in the industry was that. And from, I don't want to date myself here, but from the mid 80s to 2000, I think that getting the serious injuries down and then kind of having them stuck somewhere. I think that was a fairly common trend. But let me, if I can, go to you then, John. Essentially the same question, just trying to, I know though, just from working with you and also from the conversations we have, that you haven't had a serious injury, let alone a fatality, in long time. I mean, safest company in America award twice in the last 5 or 7 years. They typically don't give that out when you're killing a lot of people. At least one would hope the selection committee would have at least a bit of that in the criteria. But you did mention when we were on the phone a serious, was it back injury, I believe, John, or something like that.
Yeah.
So anyhow, just tell us a bit about Scott Forge over the last sort of 10 years, and the serious injuries and what's happened, the trends, plateaus, etc.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. And very similar to David's story, when I got here, we were having tremendous injuries. And I've been doing this particular job for almost 23 years now. And we started really focusing in on the behaviors, because ours is an environment where we can't put a guard around every piece of equipment. We use large mobile equipment. We're dealing with large pieces of metal. And so I can't bubble wrap my environment, so that decision-making process is critical. And we started working on that through the traditional means of behavior-based safety, and started driving those numbers down. And when I say the traditional means, the observation type approach to that. And then we plateaued out. We felt stuck. And we started looking around in about 2010, and we found SafeStart and implemented, and immediately saw a drop in our recordable injury rate. And we have been driving that down for about the last 8 to 10 years. And we kind of feel like we're at that plateau, very similar to David's numbers. You're starting to get in rarefied air, where you're seeing there's no trends, there's no commonality to these injuries, and every now and then something goes unexpectedly wrong and somebody gets hurt. And David's comment about using dollars to help judge the progress of your organization is actually a very interesting concept, because there were a couple of years in the recent past where we were averaging, for the handful of injuries that we're having, about a total cost of about $10,000 to $12,000. And again, you're talking 5 to 10 recordable injuries, so the cost is very low. So the magnitude or the severity of the injuries is very, very low. But every now and then, to refer back to that back injury, where someone does something, not a good decision in the moment, and it ends up being a very expensive injury, several hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the individual may not ever be the same. Now, in this particular case, the individual is working towards that 100% recovery, thankfully, but the cost involved, it can be monumental. And so when you lose the trending capability, when you've got to really think proactively, what is the next way someone can get hurt, and also look at it from the perspective of, how do I plan those jobs so that I minimize the risk? And we have been working very hard over the last couple of years, especially because of our hiring trends of hiring younger and less experienced employees, to really teach those critical thinking skills. And we continue to see the benefit of that, but we're not perfect, and we continue to have those in the moment decisions, and we are really driving home the principles that SafeStart teaches, in that you've got to understand and recognize when you are in a state that can cause you an error.
Yeah, well, I mean, you and I were talking about this. I mean, I got a couple holes in L4, L5 disc. I'm not sure it's good that they've got one on each side, balancing them out a bit, but it's not moment to moment, obviously, but all I've got to do is pick something up without thinking about it. And if I was your employee and I was on your property, that could be a very serious injury. So, there's obviously a great deal of personal responsibility, especially when it comes to the long-term back, shoulder, knee, etc. stuff. I know Alex is a former basketball player, so we can pretty much count on his knees being shot without even asking the question, right? But again, that's not really something that E-Tech's, the majority of that is going to be on you, Alex, right? Same with your back, same with me. But certainly a lot on what the company can do, John. When you think of serious injuries and fatalities, it's typically the ones that could have been a fatality, permanent dismemberment, even though what you're talking about, I know personally, is a very serious and potentially debilitating injury, the back thing, but not necessarily, like the crushed by the fork truck, that, if you will, the acute injury fatality type of thing. So not to, and certainly not to be disrespectful to the people like myself who've had serious back injuries, but the real focus of this, or what I want to get at, is that other aspect, the serious injury that could be, or the fatalities that obviously were fatalities acutely. So Alex, what trends did you notice over the last 7 years at E-Tech's? And then since everybody else has kind of chimed in a bit about what they did with it, feel free if you want. I'm gonna circle back again after talking with Peter and Tag, to get a little more detail from everybody about what they did about it and how they went about especially the initial communication process with their management group, because obviously, if you don't get step 1 accomplished, step 2, not so important, right? But tell us a bit about the trends, globally if you want, or just at E-Tech's.
Yeah, no problem. Just so everybody knows, E-Tech's is it's a global company. We're about 3 billion euros, more than 100 manufacturing sites around the world, mainly in Europe and in South America, and building materials. And very different, because it was a highly decentralized company for years and years. And part of why I was brought in was to try to professionalize and bring a little bit of more standardization on a lot of processes, including around safety. The trends are very similar to what everybody's talked about so far. If I go back, I've been there for the last 5 years. If I go back about 12 years, the reduction in injuries was about 90% from then till now. And over the last 4 to 5 years, it was about 50%. And there was, I'd say, a couple of steps along the way. The first step, quite honestly, and I'm going back to 12 years ago, it's an incredibly high incident rate, a very poor record. So the first step was literally just your classic pay attention to it, shine a light on it, make it important to management, and start getting people in tune. And that's the first step to go down. The second step was really around equipment improvements, because a lot of the factories have been built, again, not in a standardized way. So again, doing pretty basic things like guarding and latoto and links and things like that. And then the third step was really around SafeStart, around behavioral, which is what Larry and I worked together on starting a couple of years ago. And so I think all of those things contributed to the classic reduction in what we consider the broad injuries. But at the same time, if we look at, I was never comfortable, and I haven't been comfortable with where we've been on the serious injury exposure. And it's a relatively finite number. We didn't have a lot every year, but what we did was, for every incident, whether it was an injury or even the near misses we were tracking, we'd identify what was a potential life-altering event. Okay, even if it wasn't, was it a potential to do so? If something else had gone wrong and the guy had stepped 1 meter this way instead of that way, could he have fallen through, or could something have fallen on him, and all that? And when we looked at those, the numbers there weren't really going down. There was a steady amount of those every year. And just to tell you, in 5 years, 4 of the 5 years, we did not have a fatality. In 1 year, in 2018, we had 2. Okay. And again, as always, there was 12 different things that went wrong with each of those. But it's not that 1 year was much worse than the others. It was 1 year there was 2 unlucky events versus the lucky events that were happening in the other years. So that's the basics, and I think that's the core of what you're talking through there, Larry. And what we did over the last really 2 years was really start to challenge ourselves about, are we looking at this wrong? Because we were getting the results we wanted in terms of the base metrics, right? Do all these things, pay more attention, be leaders, improve the processes, improve the equipment, et cetera, and we were getting that, but we were not attacking or not getting the results we wanted in the most important thing, which was avoiding life-altering events at all costs. And what we really did is step back. We worked with some people that actually helped us investigate the fatalities, which was useful in terms of getting an outside view. And we did a couple of things. And one was really to take a different focused approach on the things that we thought could be, based on our data and based on those events, the things that were life-altering. And we centered in on 4 or 5 general areas that you'd find in your procedures, you'd find in the audits, the things we're all familiar with. We had chose work at heights, Lotutto, the high risk assessment, and confined spaces, and really decided to go much deeper in all elements there, as far as checking the procedures, the sign-off procedures, the training, the behaviors, what people knew about it, understood about it, and that's the way we started to get into that. The only other thing I'd note, and I know we can talk about this more later, Larry, was why behavior-based safety was so important to us is we made some great improvements in equipment safety. Like I said, some things that most of us would consider pretty basic, getting guarding up, et cetera, et cetera. That actually gave us a few examples of complacency setting in, that when people were working around what they knew, and I think John mentioned this, when you're working around something that you know could have this hazard, it could be dangerous, there's a different level of attention. And actually, when we made some of these areas safer, or they felt safer, we had some incidents that could have been bad because there wasn't the same level of fear, to say a different word. So I'll cut it there, Larry, and I know we can talk some more.
No, but it's interesting. My ski buddy Steve, his whole conviction is that everybody needs to have regular near-death experiences to keep their safety awareness heightened. And I said yes, but there's problems with that, Steve. Like in that, unfortunately, a lot of people will also die. So you can't just do it that way. But he's not wrong. It's just that it's not statistically it's not a good strategy to employ. Peter, what about at American Electric at AES? What were the trends? I realize it's always difficult being the 4th person, especially if it's exactly the same trend. But that's kind of what I'm trying to establish too. So sorry for putting you on the spot like this in terms of being entertaining, but yeah, tell me what happened over the last 10 years, and then maybe a bit about what you did about it, although I'm sure everybody can kind of guess by now. And then I do want to come back with, and get to tag and get back to a little more detail from everybody about how they started that process. We got a bit of it from Alex. He went back and looked at the usual suspects and started digging into what they were really doing there. So in other words, not necessarily looking for something new, but trying to find out if what we were doing had flaws in it. What happened at your place, at your company?
Thanks, Larry. Yes, I really could echo the things that David and John and Alex said about the overall decrease, and we were really battling with double-digit serious injuries and fatalities going back about 15 to 16 years, and we'll get into what we did about it. But the trends that we saw initially, Larry, is since we're a global company, We saw.
Peter, just a bit, could you give everybody just a 30-second elevator speech on AES first, and what all you did? Because it's service as well. There's a fair, you know, people just know electrical and they go, okay, but there's a fair bit that could be generation to transmission to service, et cetera. So just give us a bit of the size, scope of the company and the work you guys did.
Sure. When I was there, we had roughly 30,000 employees. You know, that number would fluctuate, of course. It's a global power company, mainly in you know, thermal power, renewables, transmission, distribution, hydroelectric, and big construction. Those were the main areas that we operated in, and it was around the world. You know, all the continents, I believe, except Australia. And so we had, you know, pretty diverse operations, diverse cultures, et cetera. So, you know, as I was saying, our trends kind of mirror what David and John and Alex said. When we first turned our attention to these serious injuries and fatalities, you know, I think just the attention that it was getting from the senior leadership, we got an initial decline in the number. But it took us a while and took us a lot of different, you know, looking at it from different angles to get it to zero. You know, one of the things that wasn't mentioned, and I wonder if the other guys have experienced this as well, you know, in some of our countries that we were doing business, once we turned our attention and finding the injuries, better defining them, what had the potential for serious injury, we saw increases in some of the businesses. And I don't think that their performance necessarily changed, but it was the more robust reporting initially got us more information about the injuries, and that's one kind of nuance that I hadn't heard mentioned yet that we saw at the beginning, right? So once we kind of got that level set of where we were actually with our performance, then we started doing some of the things that, you know, Alex and David and John mentioned, focusing on the near misses or the almost incidents that had the potential to be serious and or be a fatality, and then really kind of look at the processes from an organizational standpoint that were managing or leading those elements of our safety performance, like incident investigation, reporting. You know, were we getting all of the near misses that had the potential to be serious? Our incident investigations, were we really getting the latent root causes, or, you know, what we found is we would look at these even serious injuries, and there were a lot of physical causes for them. Once in a while, you'd get some good behavioral-based causes, but rarely did we get the latent causes, the things that initially drove us to, you know, drove us on that descending path of the serious injuries and fatalities.
Peter, let me just ask you, I'm kind of curious, because it's such a stark statistic in terms of like the 900 electrocutions every year in the United States at high, out of 1,000, so 900 at low voltage household current, 100 at high voltage, so about 1,000 electrocutions a year in the United States. Did you guys, when it was just household current, would you do anything extra if there was an electrical contact there versus high voltage, or did you just do the extra with the high voltage?
Any incident or any interaction with energy like that, Larry, all incidents were treated the same. If there was a potential for a serious injury, they were all treated exactly the same. Didn't even have to be an injury. It could be a near miss or you know, just a hazardous condition. We treated them all the same. Investigated with the same rigor, reported them, communicated them, treated them exactly.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I would echo.
I might add, Larry, a lot of our fatalities, you know, you would think because it's an electric company that they were caused by the electricity as a hazardous energy, but we had, you know, moving vehicles, working cars.
BC Hydro was mostly motor vehicles. It was more motor vehicles than electrical contacts every year.
We saw them in all the, but we started to see, you know, we'll get more when we talk about what we did, but we started seeing some trends across those, even though they weren't the same hazardous energy. We saw some, similarities in the latent causes that helped us get on that downward trend.
Well, and obviously one of the things, if you're just looking at numbers, that skews the numbers too, is if you've got a pickup truck with 5 people in it and it rolls over, you've got 5 serious injuries, 1 fatality in one incident, which is very difficult to do in terms of electrical contact, right? Fry 5 people at once is pretty hard to do. It can be done, but it's rare, right? More about one at a time. Look, I'm just going to introduce the elephant in the living room, and I'll turn it over to Teg. And I've talked to all of you about this, and that one of the obvious reasons that recordable injuries have come down versus serious injuries and fatalities is that if you've been around for a long time, you know that it was all about lost time accidents 20, 30 years ago. And then people fudged lost time accidents a lot, brought them in on stretchers. You'd hear all these sort of horror stories just so that they could pass out the 10,000 hours or the million-hour watch that they'd bought for everybody. So it switched to total recordables. But as David said, there can be a huge difference between 2 stitches and a broken arm or a broken femur. So I want to get back to this. One very convenient way of getting to the management, is what did it cost? And that way they can see the difference between 2 stitches and a broken femur quite easily. But then all the attention was on recordable injuries. So obviously, if you start putting a lot of attention on things, and you've all said this, things improve typically, like you were saying, Alex, the management, so then you start focusing on recordables. So, and recordables include musculoskeletal injuries. So obviously, if you look at the 1990s, an awful lot of companies invested in ergonomics and improving things in terms of repetitive stress, which also brought the recordables down, but obviously wouldn't have any effect on the potentially fatal acute injuries. So that's just the elephant in the living room. In other words, you change the number, the gold number that everybody was focusing on from lost time, serious injuries, which could be fudged, to recordables, which weren't as meaningful, but were more difficult to fudge. And hence you ended up with lower recordables, but not much improvement in the serious injuries. Anyhow, that's an obvious example of how, nothing necessarily related to, care, concern, humanity, or anything else. Just you focused on a number and they tried to improve the number, and that's it. So Teg, what about all the companies you've worked with? Is it the similar trend that we've heard from everybody so far? A fairly rapid downward trend and then a bit of a plateau, but the plateau not being where they wanted to be. And then where we're at right now, which is the decision process. Stay the course or do something different.
Yeah, it's I'm going to start with a very similar thing to what everybody else has said. That if you look at, let's take a higher level and start with organizations. If you look at national statistics, for example, to start with, right? US labor statistics, HSE in the UK, HSA in Ireland, Forest Safe BC. If you look at the trends, whether it's in industries or nationally, it's basically the same, where you've got the recordable injuries going down. They have done for a number of years, but then the fatality line is basically static. It's flat, right? So you can start with that, and I want to echo something that I think everyone said, that SIFs by nature, they're difficult because they're rare events, right? So when we look at what we normally do, which is we analyze things and we start teasing out, we don't have a lot of data to go with. We have a lot of we have a lot of information about an incident or a couple of incidents that we have to draw some big conclusions from, right, to try and attack the problem as a whole. So we have that as an issue. We also have a surprising issue that I've run into over the years, which is, believe it or not, different organizations kind of have a variation on what they perceive a serious injury to actually be, right? So that, and I've sat in boardrooms with organizations where they've argued that actually, if you lose the top of your finger, is that really qualified as a serious injury or not? You get into these really weird kind of conversations, which plays into the point that a lot of people have made around statistics, right? Because there's a leadership fixation on statistics and how we measure stuff and all those sort of things. So that plays as problematic for a lot of organizations. And the other thing that I want to look back on, which again, a lot of people have mentioned, is that understanding what your SIF potential is within the activities that you're doing, and it's going to be different according to the different activities that you're doing. It's the different approaches that you're going to have. Different industries and different locations might have different kind of SIF potential against what activities that happen on site. So organizations need to be across that. The approaches that most organizations seem to take seem to echo very much what Alex said, which is you look at these engineering controls, guarding controls to start with, but you get to a point where you have to look at something else. And you have to look at the individuals, how they're motivated, how are they, what sort of state they're in, if you're following SafeStart kind of language. Are we looking at those different kind of precursors? Are we sending people who are fatigued up to do certain jobs and those sort of things? Are we thinking in those kind of levels? Because you have to think in those kind of levels to drive it down and get rid of it entirely. And truth of the matter is, different organizations have different levels of sophistication tied in with that approach.
Right. But you were also mentioning, Tag, though, things like the work that lends itself, like emergency maintenance you mentioned to me on the phone. Certain types of operations, from construction to service operations, where a bit of like what John was saying, where you just you can't, the bubble packing of the whole thing and making it so there's always a barrier between the worker, the error, and the hazardous. It's just not always there, right? Certainly with a lot of mobile equipment too, you get into now another thing where we can put beepers and distance locators on people, but then what does that do for their skills when those things aren't on them in the real world, and does it make it worse? So there's definitely some things out there. But let's go back to David. David, you sort of helped us establish the trend, which again was fairly universal. But tell us a bit about the first steps. Like, okay, so you've got the data that is basically saying if we keep doing what we are doing now, it's unlikely that we will improve because we're in statistical control. So you've got to take this data and you've got to go show the management group at your company that if we just stay the course, we're not going to get any better, and staying the course isn't satisfactory. Just walk us through a couple of those steps, if you will, and then tell us how it went from there. And I'll same thing, go to John, go to Alex, Peter, and so on. And but I think if I'm putting myself in the position of a safety professional listening to this, going, okay, look, that first step is key. And if I don't get the first step, I don't get to the second step. So I've got some data. The data presents a pretty conclusive story. Now, what do I do?
Well, I'm sure that we are experiencing what a lot of people do in business these days, and that's called attrition. You have attrition of people, whether it's through age, retirement, or just skill set. People can't do the kind of work that you're doing in the 21st century. And so one of the things we recognized is we saw the patterns early on of people in our organizations when they still got hurt and they had complacency and they'd been here 20 years or 40 years even. And so we recognized that, the old man method machine type thing we learn in industrial engineering that contributes to the way you operate. The man piece is always your key component. And so we took the look at the age of our workforces, and we also saw that we were going to be losing people. So our biggest challenge next was how do we keep from having people seriously hurt who come into the organization with less skill? I mean, I made a statement to you. You'd ask one of our newer hire guys who didn't have any experience on the shop floor, go get a bolt. He'd say, "Do you want to supersize that?" You know, he didn't. Some of these guys didn't know. You know, they really, didn't. That wasn't their
I
background.
did like that one, John. Yeah, yeah. I don't know what a bolt is, right? But
Yeah,
I hear
yeah,
that all the time in the oil rigs too,
yeah,
though, Dave. People, we got all the kids from the farm that were kind of, they're used to tractors, they're hydraulics, PLCs.
sure.
They got a
Yeah.
sense of things. We're getting kids from the city who don't know anything other than how many ketchups you want with that, and
Yeah,
they're working with equipment that can kill you easily, right? So it's
yeah,
not a good fit, right? So
yeah. So we infused a safety net of really building up our training and orientation of safety to people in the company. That was a big switch. And we really basically said, we're not going to put these guys on the shop floor until they've had certain baseline instruction, including beginning SafeStart, and that they worked with their colleagues on the floor. The second half of those days, they got that training on applying those skills in the work area that they're in. So we really recognize the need to do that. And although, again, this is another example where our, the numbers didn't just keep falling, they were pretty flat, but we had guys that weren't experienced, and if they did get hurt, it was very minor. And so, that was our basic way of saying, how do we keep these guys from getting hurt badly? Because we knew it could go bad for them, probably worse than the average bear. And we had a fatality years ago of a young guy who was here for not very long, and we knew exactly what contributed to that, and so we recognized that for us, our light keeps turning off in my room, unfortunately.
right.
We had to basically look ahead. We had to get a view ahead of where our next set of risks are. What was our high potential? And that's one thing I'll mention. This mentioned to you, I think, this GRI 403, which is a health and safety reporting standard that we're going to next year. And it has a couple of new things, and one of them is high consequence work-related injury, which you have to deal with, which means if that person can't get back to 100% in 6 months, then that's a stat. That's a 1 for that. Because now, even though the guy may have returned to work on a part-time basis or a restricted work, he is affected now beyond 6 months, and that was a high consequence injury. The other thing you have to do in this reporting is you have to report on high potential work-related incident arrangements, where you have things where you go through with your employees, what are the highest risk type work you do, and evaluate how to offset that through a more intense risk assessment and change methodologies you can do in that type of work. So it really starts looking forward to, hey, what could go wrong, and collaborating with the employees on that. And I think that's really important, because a lot of times we make assumptions behind a desk and they know a lot better.
Okay. All right. Well, John, let me go basically to the next question for you then, which is when you saw the trend, you already told us a bit about what you did about it, but maybe sort of how's it working? And also, I know Scott Forge is very, very family oriented, employee owned company. The original owners made it available to the employees for purchase, so there's a great deal of camaraderie there. But you managed, I think, to get the culture to take the concern for serious injuries and fatalities 24/7. Like, in other words, it wasn't, I don't think there's anybody at Scott Forge that think that Scott Forge only cares about fatalities on the job. I think I think in order to get where you don't get there without a bit more heart and mind to the whole thing, which obviously, from a personal perspective, I don't know about you guys, I'm not too fussy about where I die. I just don't, like Gary always says, I just don't want it to be today, right? So tell us a bit about that, John, and what you did. Like, how did you start though? Like, that's the part when you had the data and you knew you needed to do something. Just a little detail of those first steps for everybody.
Well, to your point, we made it very, very personal. We made everyone understand why we were doing this. This was not about numbers. This was not about dollars and cents. This was about ensuring that you had a good quality life with your family outside of the four walls of Scott Forge, and making sure that we knew what it took to understand what you were doing so that we could plan that job effectively, so that you could go home and enjoy the things that you have waiting for you, your family, your hobbies, whatever the case may be. So it was a very big push early on when we had those high injury numbers to say, time out, guys. We are going to have a shift in our mindset to make sure that everybody goes home. And it's going to take all of us working together to make that happen. So that could not have happened without that camaraderie that you spoke of. And then we really focused in on understanding what was getting our people hurt. And honestly, it's boiled down to 6 basic things. And as we teach pre-planning of jobs, we need to make sure that we have these 6 bases covered, and making sure that every day that as we approach our work, we are looking for those things. It's not rocket science when you're dealing with sharp or hot metal. What you need to do to keep yourself away and uninjured from that. You've got large vehicles, understanding that line of fire aspect of our safety program. And so, we really made sure that our people understood that out of all the equipment that we have within these 4 walls, our people are the only asset that increases in value over the course of time. We pour more education into them. They develop more skills. They are a commodity within our organization that is the only one that is increasing in value. So we need to understand as leadership the stewardship responsibility that we have with those individuals. And so that personalization, that understanding what was that could start that injury cycle, because ultimately once the injury cycle starts, it's random, choice or random outcomes that say how bad that injury is going to be. And in our world, in the blink of an eye, it can be life-changing or life-ending. And we talk about that all the time because of the size and power of the equipment that we use. And so, when we talk about how we revamped our training and making sure that people understood that when you are given a new employee that probably, to David's point and your point was, worried about getting from, homeroom class to their next class 6 months ago, and am I going to make it in the passing period? Understanding that they don't have those critical thinking skills, and understanding what it takes to teach this next generation how to play in a very dangerous playground, because I can't put bubble wrap on everything. I can't put a guard in front of everything. And so that high risk concept that David talked about, we talk about a high risk of the day in an individual department every day at our shift kickoff meetings. We line out and make sure it's real clear to our folks, like, of all the jobs that we're going to be doing within this department, this is the one that has the biggest potential to hurt us. And again, coming back, we want to make sure that injury cycle just never even starts in the first place.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you, John. I mean, I just got to throw one quick example out here, leading into Alex. Not mentioning any specific locations, Alex, but and I'm going down the stairs with the plant manager to do a tour of the plant. And on the way down the stairs, his phone rings and he pulls his phone out and he answers his phone and he talks on the phone while he walks down the rest of the stairs. And then when we get to the plant, I'm about to walk in and he says something about the hearing protection. And I said, oh, thanks. And he looks at me and he says, well, I wouldn't let you in unless you were wearing it. And I'm going, really? You wouldn't let me in the plant without wearing these little earplugs. It's probably about 105 decibels. Meanwhile, you ran down the stairs, pulled your phone out and answered it without holding the handrail. Now, that to me is a potential fatality because he could hit his head and the chances of him getting the reflex in time aren't good with the phone and everything else. And that I don't see a lot of at companies. The idea that the guy had two hands in his pockets because it was cold outside, slipped and fell backwards on the stairs. And you didn't investigate that as a potential fatality because there wasn't enough height compared to what your traditional thinking would be. But you don't need that much height if you don't get a reflex. Anyhow, Alex, on to you because we only have so much time. A bit about what you did at the corporate level there at ETEX. How did you get them?
Yeah.
How did you get them to make the move from the data,
Well,
or was the data just so clear that you didn't really need to do anything?
I'll go into that, Larry, but I've got to build off of what you just said because it's actually a very pertinent thing in my life. Because I think for all of us, change happens when you make.
You know the plant, right? You know what I'm talking about. You know where I
No,
was.
I do. But let me tell you a little story because I think change happens when you make an emotional connection. And I had an emotional connection about 10 years ago. I was working for my company before ETEX, and we had done an acquisition of a factory in Germany. And I was literally touring the plant with this German plant manager, so it's actually on the same level, and he's grabbing the handrails up and down the stairs. And I asked him, I said, is that policy here, right? Is everybody doing that? And he basically told me a story that 2 years earlier, they had a fatality in the plant from somebody who fell down the stairs. And it was such an emotional moment for him telling the story because I could see how much it hit him that the emotion transferred to me. So you can imagine how much emotion it was on him that the story stuck with me. And I've been able to transfer that story to people and actually use it as an emotional way to try to get people to adhere to that. And I think holding the rail is one thing, but there's tons and tons of other examples there. So let me go quickly though, if you can, because I think we all have the same challenges. And one of the challenges around safety is if you ask, what do you want to make better on safety? Of course, the answer is everything, right? But to do it effectively as leaders, as managers, we have to make some choices. You have to give people an actionable plan. And I think the messaging that these guys talked about isn't a very important one because you have to start by giving people the why. And in a global company, the why may be a little bit different. I mean, we had very easily to do that in Latin America. People linked into the family, and going to Africa and Asia, they don't get why you would actually take care of people, because they're much safer in the factory than getting in and out of work. So that's one challenge. But what we really did based on the data and what I mentioned was we tried to focus it into two areas to say, what are the things that are really going to reduce significant injuries? And we called one area the places where we know there's high risk. Okay. And I listed off those areas where you would typically have procedures and working at heights, et cetera. And what we discovered through our investigations was we weren't as safe as what we thought. We had procedures, we had permitting, we had things that were supposed to happen on every one of these things. But when we really got into it, plant by plant, shift by shift, they weren't happening perfectly. There wasn't as good awareness as what there needed to be. And part of it might be complacency, part of it is training, part of it is people understanding the importance of it. So one focus area was make those things as robust as they should be, right? We know about it, we have procedures, make them right, make them consistent, and let's not have something happen for something we knew about or we knew we could prevent. So that became an area to make those existing things robust as possible. And then the second area is what we said, and different names for it, what we call the non-routine activities, something, because that was the area where you don't have a procedure, you don't have a process. It could be something as simple as, a guy's driving a truck in a route in the first time, or a fork truck in a different way, or you just built the factory, there's 1,000 things you can think of. And we did narrow it to, okay, give people better skills and training on doing last minute risk assessment, about assessing where the risks are, about doing a 4 eyes principle more often than not, about not just you, but have somebody else come in and take 2 minutes to look at, could there be a risk here, and try to eliminate things that way. And again, if I translate it back to the 2 most serious incidents we had, one was in the former category, one was in the latter. One, there should have been procedures, if they were followed to the letter, that would have prevented that fatality, and they weren't for various reasons. And for, you know, and so that was one. And the other was, and the second category, the non-routine, is also where the hero complex comes into play. And I think in a lot of factories, people want to do a good job, they want to go above and beyond, and they're trying to do the right things. And that's when a lot of times the bad incident happens. And so those are the 2 ways that we said, again, combined with the messaging, we want to make these things better. And we're seeing some progress on it.
But no, I think, Alex, I think that's really, I mean, Keg, I know you're making a flurry of notes here, and of course, you know, it's your job to sum everything up perfectly at the end of the show. But I think that's a great takeaway, though, Alex. And you know, on one hand, look at what you've got and go over it and see whether or not it's all full of holes or not. I mean, how old is it? How up to date is it? You know, for all your critical stuff, the usual suspects, heights, confined space.
And do people really do it? You have to get brutally honest about, are they really doing it, right? And create that environment. And that's a tough thing to do.
No, and I can remember Higby saying, you know, and if you're showing them the same lockout tagout video that you've shown for the last 12 years, give it up. You're you can do enough fire drills to make people complacent. So don't be unaware of the human factor component in what you're doing as well too, right? Like, in other words, breathe some life into those critical things to make people focus and be aware, because they're not insignificant, right? You know, the amount of hazardous energy is not insignificant. I live at Whistler, and as soon as the mountain bike park opens up in the summertime, the helicopter goes every day. There's only about 1,000 people in the bike park. There's 20,000 skiers on the mountain. The helicopter doesn't go every day when they're skiing. So the amount of hazardous energy, you know, having a metal titanium bike between your legs versus nothing, it adds to the hazardous energy. So there's definitely something to it. But that isn't all of it. And I think so. You want to go back and look at that, but you also want to look at, like I said, the no reflex on the stairway type of thing as well. Now, Peter, with electricity, the reflex thing isn't as big a deal, right? Like you and I were talking about, you know, when I'm talking with electrical workers, I always used to say, I don't care if you're Spider-Man, you're not faster than the electricity. So it's about the mind on task and preventing the contact in the first place. But then, like you said, the majority of the serious injuries and fatalities aren't involving electricity with electrical workers to begin with. So what did you do with the data? How did you present it to the managers, and how did you go forward from the plateau?
Larry, let me put it in a lot of the things that were already mentioned, we took advantage of, you know, making things personal, looking hard looks at our procedures and policies. But, you know, real quickly, if I can kind of summarize our downward trend, when we look at that in hindsight, there were some inflection points that changed the slope of the curve in the right direction that I think are worth noting for the folks that are on the phone. And the first one was the very first change in that, that inflection point that changed the slope in the right direction was getting the executive leadership really committed to making this change and cascading that throughout the organization. That was the very first one. The second inflection point we had that changed that slope in the right direction was we thought it was a development of our SIF, we called it our SIP program, but it was really once everyone in the organization saw the value of the near misses that had the potential for, you know, whether they were in the expected category or unexpected category, and starting to report those and doing meaningful things about them. That was the second inflection point. And I think the other one was when we really got all the leadership, not just safety leadership, but the operations leaders, all the leaders in the business, to get some skin in the game, to get them involved in the overall management, get, you know, if you will, get safety integrated into the overall way we do things, right? It's not a tack on anymore. Part of the way that we do things all the time, and get the leadership at all levels of the organization to buy into that concept and take ownership for safety. That was another inflection point. And now that, you know, it's to the point where I think John used the term rarefied air. When you're really getting to where you have like little spikes, where you have the unfortunate incidents once in a while that you kind of scratch your head. That's where I think it really comes down to the personal skills that everybody's been talking about. Good decision making, teaching people how to make good decisions, why it's important to follow the rules and procedures that Alex was talking about, and having those things happen in that kind of order will set you up for success. If senior leadership's involved, if you're identifying the things that are going to hurt people, and you got the leadership at all levels of the organization involved, you can work towards developing those personal skills that ultimately are going to make the progress that we're making sustainable, and maybe get that last inflection point when you're in that rarefied air to get it at zero and keep it at zero.
Yeah, I think like I don't know if I've said this to you, Peter, or maybe with Alex when I was talking to you. There's a point, obviously, where you can do. I grew up kind of under the idea that everything could be a failure of leadership. The leadership wasn't doing enough, and then I had kids, and I couldn't keep them from getting hurt. And it certainly wasn't because I wasn't committed enough or my wife wasn't committed enough. And you realize about the skills and stuff. But so I do believe there's a baton that has to be passed off. I don't think you can do it all for other people, even your children, when they're more than arm's length away from you. But I do believe there has to be a baton you're passing, and it's got to be genuine, and it's got to have more than be careful. Like, that's all we got handed from our grandmother. It's not because she didn't love us, it's because she didn't have anything else. But if that's all the baton you've got, they already got that, right? They got it from other people up before you got to them. So, we've got to give them more value than that if we want to get them to take the baton. I can't expect anybody to reach out for be careful. You've already heard be careful 10,000 times. I'm not likely going to reach out for it the 10,001st time. Anyhow, Teg, it is your somewhat unenviable job, given all that we've heard, to sum all of this up. Certainly the two main themes: stay the course, but make sure you're doing it better. Alex certainly emphasized that, and then pretty much everybody here, they did make a change, and kind of how we know them, they made the change towards SafeStart and to take a more, if you will, meaningful baton to their folks. But what else did you hear out from the focus groups too, Teg? And then we're close to the time mark too, so you got 3 or 4 minutes, Teg, to sum it all up for us, and then give us all the path forward, if you wouldn't mind. And
okay, all right. Well, I've got, I think, 4 big takeaways from this conversation. The first one is that this whole leadership, making it personal, change happens through emotional connection kind of piece. I think that's critically important. I mean, I think everyone said that in one form or another. The importance of connecting people on an emotional kind of level, making sure that leadership communicates that well and understands it well. But Larry, you said something really, really important at the end there, that there's a thing about being genuine in that, because as individuals, we know when we hear messages, and we can tell when people are being genuine or not. We make a judgment call on that. So that is a critical part of that. And that ties in with being honest about the current situation and what organizations and people are going to do and what they're going to do. That buy-in piece that Pete was talking about, that was first. The second thing then is a build on what Alex said about looking at doing things differently, looking at the problem differently. And there's a bunch of stuff that comes out of that. There's the making it personal, again, from a leadership perspective. There's the skills in the individuals that we've been talking about. So we're aware of the exposures around us. We're aware, we're looking at things. We're aware of the state that we may be in. We're self-triggering on different pieces. There's hazard recognition skills. There's the metrics that we're using and what we're looking on, which I'll come on to in a minute. There's the training that we give these people, how we give it to them, how do we reinforce that? And also that we make sure that the organization understands, again, to Alex's point, it understands how things really work. Because what a lot of organizations have is they have a system that's beautifully designed and it's well thought out, but it plays differently in practice. So do we really understand that? Do we really get that? Are we across that? The other thing that ties in with that then is this kind of theme that because these things are rare, there's a resilience that's required in organizations to make sure that that pressure is kind of consistent. Again, that plays into leadership and what they emphasize in the messaging they have. Again, it plays into the skills that the individuals have and what they're thinking of. But that emotional piece to me is critical to that too. You know, if we build that emotional kind of bridge, that becomes much, much easier. It becomes naturally the way that organizations do things and they approach things. And the final bit then is on the metrics themselves. You know, what do we measure? How do we measure it? Do we measure SIF potential? How do we treat it? Whether it's a near SIF event or something else, you know, how seriously does the organization interrogate that? Are we good at interrogating it? A lot of organizations are not good at interrogating that information as well as they could. So what's our skill set in that? And then how do we as organizations take the exposure away, whether it's the skills of the individual and what we're giving them so that they can make the right decisions, they can make the safe decisions, or if it's more of an engineering kind of issue that requires a different kind of fix. So yeah, so that's kind of what I took away.
Well, I take one thing just to tag on to that, and it came from the expert panel webinar I did with the Middle East for HSE Global just a couple days ago, and that is the consequences of the reporting of a potential SIF. And I'll just give you a little quick anecdote, but it goes back to senior safety advisor for a major, one of the biggest in the world oil companies in Canada. And he was lamenting about how their near miss reporting had gone down. And he was speaking right after me at this conference in Calgary. And he then told me that he just about got smoked by a truck blowing through a red light because he was rushing to the conference. And I said, well, why don't you report that as a near miss? And he looked at me and he said, because they'd make me go to 4 hours of red means stop, yellow means caution, green means go training. Whenever it's human error, Larry, we just re-indoctrinate the person because we don't know what else to do. So I don't feel like 4 hours of defensive driving, that's what'll happen if I report this. So I'm not going to report it. So here he is complaining that nobody else is reporting this stuff. And then he doesn't want to report it because he doesn't necessarily want the cure, if you will, for the problem being bestowed upon him. So there's that as well too with the metrics that monkeys everything up or muddies the water too, which is, you know, if I go back to the plant manager that I was referring to before, running down the stairs, answering the phone, he's not going to be reporting that as a potential SIF because what he did does not look good in front of his workforce at all. He was actually hoping that I wouldn't have seen it and that I wasn't going to comment on it. And I'm like, well, then you would have thought, you know, as an observation coach, I wasn't too swift, right? You know, how did you ever get where you know, that was your first 10 years in this career. How'd you ever get where you are now? You couldn't see that. So it's there's a lot of muddy water too. I think that companies have to be willing to see their way through. What is a potential SIF, right? How many have you had? Like when we talk to people and get them to talk about how many potentially fatal close calls have you had? I mean, one of the things I'll always do is I'll say, you know, how many of you have been over the front handlebars of your bicycle when you were a kid? And the whole room puts their hand up. And I say, were you wearing a helmet? And they don't know. Well, how many of you fell backwards at least once off your bicycle without wearing a helmet? And again, you've got everybody's hand in the air. And every one of those we know is a potential SIF if there was a curb or a rock there. Every one of those. But that's not typically what people think of when they think of potentially fatal close calls. They think of the time where they nearly got hit by the car at 60 miles an hour on their bicycle, or when they nearly went off of a cliff or something like that, right? But they don't tend to think of that simple head bang or something like that hitting your neck. And, you know, your grandmother was always saying that too, you know, like the two injuries, break your neck, poke your eye out, right? Those were the two things that could happen to you. But we don't tend to look at that traditionally in the workplace nearly as much. Anyhow, anything else, Teg, before I sort of sum it up for everybody and say thank you? So
No,
just,
I think you've done it beautifully, actually.
okay, well, look, first of all, everybody, thanks very much. And I think the two main things I'd suggest is, look, go back and look at all of the usual suspects, your procedures and stuff, like Alex was saying. You know, are they as good as you think they are? Just make sure they are. Okay, make sure they're what they should be, and the people obviously understand them and follow them, motivated, all that. And then I think the other part that all of you suggested was don't sit on the data and expect it's just going to get better all by itself. Do something. You know, thank you very much for the direction that you took, I guess is what I would like to say. And for all of you listening, thanks very much. We got a few questions in. One of them is just really simple. It just says, what's the difference between recordable injuries? We tracked it too, which in most cases are serious injuries. So that's an interesting comment. Kind of atypical, I must say. Typically, most of them won't be serious. Most of them would be more towards the minor end of the recordable injuries. So anyhow, if you're still listening, whoever you are, it's Larry at SafeStart.com. Send me an email, and between myself and the panelists, we will get back to you with some answers or try to help you with that, because that's a bit unusual that you've got more serious injuries out of the mix of total recordables than the other way around. So we'd have to delve into that a bit. But again, thanks very much, everybody. So let me just read you the blurb on the next webinar, and hopefully 4 weeks from now you can attend at the same time. But the next one is excellent safety equals excellent business performance. Yes, but is it cause or is it just correlation? So every manager knows that good safety equals good business because injuries and incidents cost money. But some senior managers and executives believe that excellent safety equals excellent business performance. And they've shifted their thinking toward the concept of high reliability, which by definition addresses the need to manage human error proactively. But here's where this came from, guys. I work with so many plant managers who have told me, you know, this is my 5th plant, whatever, 6th plant I've managed. The way I do it is I get everybody engaged in safety. It's something I can get everybody rallied around. And from there, their belief is that turns into excellent performance. But they really can't tell you much more than it's worked for me before, and that's why I'm doing it again. So is it cause or is it just correlation? And that's what we wanted to sort of explore on the next webinar. And within that, hopefully, the value of moving beyond just good safety performance in your industry category to excellent safety performance. And hopefully we'll be able to explain the causal relationship between that excellent safety and the excellent performance. And it's not just, at least in my opinion, it's not just correlation, but it's not about, it's not so much about my opinions, about the opinions that you guys have and the experience that you guys have. So hopefully you can all join us. Literally 4 weeks from today, we'll get some more promotion out. But thanks again, everybody. Thanks very much for your time, and thanks very much for the comments. And looking forward to talking with you next month if you can make it. I'm not sure if you could, John. I know, and Jessica from Tesla. Sorry, Mary Jo from Tesla is going to be joining us next time, but hopefully we'll see you all again. Okay, so thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Yep.